Lonnie. Can you guys hear me? Yep. Is that okay? Okay, good. So, Dan, when Lonnie approached me about doing this, I was so thrilled because I thought, oh, here I get a chance to have Daniel Sullivan as my mentor for an hour. How long do we have here? About an hour, right? Yeah. Because what you guys all should know is that directors getting together that does not happen. The opportunity for directors to gather and talk is very, very rare. There aren't any directing conferences. We don't get to gather in the green room before a show opens and have small talk and inspire each other. It just doesn't happen. So this is a very rare opportunity indeed, and so thank you so much, Lonnie, for this. And what you don't know, Dan, is that such a unique opportunity is this, that I actually reached out to some of my colleagues, my directing colleagues of my generation, and I said, I get to interview Daniel Sullivan. If you got to be in a room with Daniel, what would you ask him? So these questions that I'm asking tonight, they are peppered with some of my colleagues' questions as well, because this is sort of a master class for us, all right? So without naming names, I'm going to, let's begin.
Absolutely.
There are many questions.
And by the way, if any of you others need mentoring, I'm available.
Well, that's good to know. I didn't know it was that easy. So great. So I'm sort of dividing these into three sections, sort of your background, and then sort of how the field has changed for directors since you began, and then a little bit about process. Okay? So, Mr. Sullivan.
Yes.
How did you get your start in the theater?
My parents put me into a ballet school when I was a kid. So my only experience with performance was dancing. And when I went to college, and I was in the English department at San Francisco State College, I was looking for stuff to do at night, and so I danced in the musicals, in the chorus of the musicals at San Francisco State College. And that's how I sort of got introduced to theater to begin with. And it was in that process that I read plays, and I actually understood that plays were literature, and sort of in the world that I was studying at State College. And so got interested in how you did plays. That was it.
And so, you started as a dancer.
Yeah.
But you've also acted.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you went from the chorus of the musical into the smaller roles in the musicals, and so I was an actor.
And what made you decide to leave dancing and acting and start to direct?
I guess it was just when I was in a play, I was a little more interested in what the other people were doing than what I was doing.
Same.
So I sort of, is that what you did?
Absolutely. Yeah? I got bored as an actor, actually.
Yeah, I don't know if it was boring so much as it seemed a little more interesting. Well, what they were doing seemed more interesting than what I was doing.
You mean what the director was doing was more interesting?
What I was doing as an actor, I just thought, like, isn't it interesting how they can make all of that happen? and so it just sort of expanded from there into looking at what was happening with the sets and the lights, and it seemed as though the world of the actor was sort of more intensely focused on one thing. Right. And I was just too interested in everything else.
Right, the whole scope of the whole scope of it. Yeah. And well, first of all, you told Lonnie and I something backstage or in the green room about your stage presence in New York. Can you tell us a little bit about where you were seen in New York?
Oh, well, this is interesting. I was the first actor on stage at the Vivian Beaumont Theater in 1965 in Danton's Death, a play that was not particularly well received. But Herb Blau, who had directed it, had put together a sort of pre-show moment And I ran on as a as a French aristocrat, and I was followed by 4 female sans-culottes who I remember had wooden swords, not particularly destructive. And they then gutted me with their swords, and I was revolved off stage.
Was there like
to
real blood?
titters
Or
from
was
the
there
audience, as I recall.
obscene, in other words,
Yes,
off stage?
yes, that was the sort of end of me. But I was the first person on stage at the Vivian Beaumont Theater.
And just with my brief history of knowing about the Vivian, well, the Vivian Beaumont is it's the proscenium, right? Weren't you also?
No, it's the big. It's the big.
It's the proscenium.
I guess you would call it a proscenium.
Yes,
no?
but weren't you also in the Mitzi Newhouse?
The Mitzi Newhouse was called the Forum Theater in 1965, and I was also the first actor on stage at the Mitzi Newhouse Theater, also in a play called In Three Zones by the wonderful director-writer Will Leach. And it was a play that never actually opened.
Oh.
It was considered so experimental, and audiences were leaving in droves. So they never actually opened it. We ran it for like 3 or 4 weeks, and that was the end of it. And it actually closed the Forum Theater. Nothing was done down there in the Mitzi Newhouse for a couple of years after that.
And that's it's in the configuration of the 3/4.
It's the 3/4. It's actually
Right.
both theaters are designed by Melziner, and they're both 3/4. But I remember when we were doing the technical rehearsal for the In Three Zones in the Forum Theater, and Joe Melziner was standing with me in the back of the theater, and he said, "This one works." He was trying to figure out, because he was getting all kinds of criticism for the Vivian Beaumont, because it was not a proscenium, it wasn't a thrust, it was trying to be too many things. And he was questioning himself and his design at that time.
Well, it's very interesting, because I remember Andre Bishop telling me about the space at the Mitzi Newhouse and how tricky it was, that 3/4, and that that it was a real challenge for directors to work in that space and try to figure out how the space can actually respond to the audience.
I did, as a director, after the horrendous experience of being an actor in a show that closed before it opened, I did a lot of shows down there as a director. And part of the problem with the space, though I do love the space, is the rap is so extreme that you're actually always looking at audience. So those plays that sort of include audience are really interesting there. And there's absolutely no backstage space. So if you're ambitious technically, you're at a loss in that space.
Yeah. It seems to me that since then, directors, it's something that I think Andre really thinks about, a director coming in and understanding how that space works.
Right, exactly.
So I'm curious, we were also talking in the green room about this proliferation in the last probably 30 years of MFA programs for directors, training programs for directors, which were not a thing that was around when you were starting out. So without that sort of kind of training, what was your experience? How did you learn how to direct?
Well,
how
I guess
did that
it was
happen?
really more about, you just had to see as much as you possibly could. And also, as an actor, if there was a director that you were working with that you particularly admired, it would be studying that particular technique, if there was a technique. And usually, hopefully, if there is a technique, it's sort of buried, you don't really see it, so you have to sort of suss it out and begin to understand how that director is going about what they're doing. But you weren't privy to what 90% of the work is that we do as directors, which is not the work that we do with actors. It's how we prepare, how we imagine, how we work with designers, how we create the world. And by the time we go into rehearsals, that's already done.
Right.
And that was something, that was a process I had to really learn in practice as I went as I did productions. I didn't really quite understand it. And even to this day, don't quite understand it.
I'm with
but,
you.
Yeah, but
It's an ongoing education.
right.
Yeah. But you did assist a few people, right?
Yeah, and that, so I could sit and watch the process in the room, but in some ways it was a little more negative a process of learning. That is, I would see a thing and think, well, I wouldn't do that. And finally, I think, as someone who had been an actor, certainly I learned how to work with actors from, I would never say to an actor, for instance, something that I wouldn't want said to myself as an actor. So I'm not a very controlling director in that way. I put most of it into the casting process, and I hope that the actors that I've hired will bring to the table the impulses that I feel should be there.
And when you were assisting, were you not privy to the design process? You weren't. So that really truly was.
Yeah,
you were sort of like
that's right. And
dropped into the deep
I think
end.
most assistants, most of us have assistants when we're working in New York here, and most assistants are not really part of that whole long process, because that starts months ahead of time. So they sort of come into it with that part of it, like an actor does. They come into it with that thing already built, already decided upon.
And who were when you were younger and you were sort of modeling yourself maybe on certain directors, who were those directors? Do you?
Ellis Rabb was a director that I worked with here at Lincoln Center. And he was someone who loved actors. He just loved actors, and actors knew that he loved them. And the collaboration was one of equals, not of someone who's going to tell you what to do, but someone who admired your skills. And so the collaboration was one of equals. And I just thought that I think that was the first real learning experience that I had about how you go about it, or how you can go about it in a fulfilling way.
So he really did have an impact on you, and it's something that really, yes, impacted you. And this is sort of the way that you proceed in your process.
Yeah.
What was the first play you ever directed?
The first play I ever directed was a play called Scenes from American Life by A.R. Gurney. And the play that and that was 1969. And the play that I'm opening tomorrow night on Broadway is by A.R. Gurney, a play called Sylvia. So we've known each other and been friends for 46 years.
Great.
And have done a lot of plays together. And Sylvia is a revival. It was done, I guess, 20 years ago. And I didn't direct the first production of it, so.
What is that like? I mean, do you have any idea? You must have seen that other production.
I did. I loved it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how do you do? I mean, this is a question that I have too. If you see another director's production of something, how do you? Has that?
Well, you steal as much as you can, or as much as you can remember. It's 20 years ago. I couldn't remember that much. But virtually all the people that you bring into the process, from the actors to the designers, it changes it all. So it's a very new sort of take on it. And it's very much a performance piece. So the actors, the fact that the actors are different just completely changes everything.
It's true, right? Because plays are actually not just literature; they are live events,
That's right? That's
and
right.
I'm curious. I mean, how A.R. Gurney is. Is he in rehearsals with you?
No, Pete doesn't come to rehearsals much. As a matter of fact, when I did his play, well, this is how a directing career begins. Jules Irving had this company, and I was a member of the company as an actor. And I wasn't in a show, so he's now paying me, and we got about $125 a week. So he felt like, I'm paying this guy and he's not doing anything. And somebody else was directing this play, Scenes from American Life, and it didn't work out, so they fired him after about a week. And Jules comes to me and he says, you think you know what you're doing, why don't you go down there and direct that play? That's how I started directing.
That doesn't happen these days anymore.
No,
I don't think that's actually how it happens.
But he was just trying to save $125 a week.
That's pretty incredible.
That was what it was. And he knew that I could actually sort of bluff my way through a rehearsal.
But you also then had to go into tech, and you had to...
I had to do all of that stuff.
You had to do all of that stuff.
Yeah.
And where was this play?
It was down in what is now the Mitzi Newhouse Theater.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to get to this later, but that's also a very... things have changed since then.
Yes, they have.
In terms of how directors get work, but it's so romantic, and I think that's so romantic and exciting.
And a little foolish when you think about it.
Foolish, but look where you are now. So clearly it works.
Yeah.
I mean, on some level, right?
Yeah.
So, has there been in your career a play that you worked on or something that you've worked on that has changed the way you work on plays? Or do you know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm sure we all sort of like learn as we go along, and we learn things from different plays, but can you identify, and maybe you can't, a project that you worked on that sort of enlightened you in a way that steered you in a different direction?
I couldn't tell you exactly what it would have been, but there came a time fairly late in my career, I think, where I began to trust the actor more, and where I began to think, I would love to do a show where I didn't ever have to tell anybody what to do at all. And there have been a couple of productions where the casting was just right, the people I knew brought everything to the table, where when we started to stage, I didn't actually ever say much of anything. And it just began to happen. The behavioral stuff was in place, and we just went. And to me, that's heaven. When all of the instincts align, and everybody understands the work, both intuitively and physically. They just sort of get it, and that's the best.
And so your job then becomes not getting in their way.
Well, you always get in their way. You're always going to get in their way to some extent, but it's that impulses are there from the very start.
Yeah.
And you're not having to either manufacture impulses, and you're not actually having to constantly push people forward, but they go in a natural way. And the rehearsal process is a sort of wonderful evolution as opposed to a forced march.
So, I mean, this brings me to the god-awful question that's the most difficult thing to answer, perhaps, but how would you define what a director does? I mean, this is glorious to hear, because I feel like, yes, you sit back and you're trusting everyone's instincts, and yes, I think I would think that most of us directors would hope for that.
Right.
Would hope for that scenario, which is rare, if ever. And even so, though, what is it that we do as directors?
Well, doesn't it change from project to project? I mean, if you're going to do a show at the Delacorte, say, you get started 6 months ahead of time. You have long, involved conversations with your designers, with your dramaturg, with the artistic director. It takes a long time. The gestation period is is a very, very long period of time. If you're doing a contemporary one-set play that obviously would have strong subtext, but the text itself is very, very clear, that job is completely different. You don't spend the days, sleepless nights, trying to, rejecting one concept after another in your head, as you would if you were attempting to do a play of Shakespeare's, or a play that has a sort of imaginative center. So it's always going to change, but the time in the rehearsal room, the few weeks that you have in a rehearsal room, is just the end game of directing. You have spent an extraordinary amount of time imagining it before you actually imagine it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, but I think, and I think just listening to you, in the end, I think the process is very different from piece to piece, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's such a struggle. I mean, this is a question that's actually, I was watching an interview between Richard Eyre and Peter Brook, and Richard Eyre asks Peter Brook, what does a director do? And he very, very cunningly evaded the question because it's so much, and then it's also so simple, right? What we do.
Exactly.
And it can be, we all try to encapsulate it, but it's always exploding. I mean, I think that what we do is we write the production, right? So that the playwright writes the play, the text.
Yeah.
We write the production. I mean, to sort of unpack what that is enormous, and we could be here for days, I think, explaining what it is we do from day to day. And, the actors, we understand what they do because we can see them.
Yes.
The writers, we understand because we have the text. The designers, we see their work. And we are an invisible, for the most part, I mean, depending on the director, an invisible component that actually is responsible for the music of it all coming together.
Right.
But I think that's absolutely right, that each project demands of us a slightly different.
For example, I did a play a few years ago called Rabbit Hole by David Lucier. Wonderful play. First scene takes place in a kitchen. So we read it through a few times, not very many times because the actors were so in tune with it. And we start rehearsing it. There's a refrigerator on stage, there's a stove, etc. The actors immediately are into the refrigerator. First day, first hour of rehearsal, they're working the kitchen, and we're going. The instincts are alive and working. I did a play, Cymbeline, in Central Park this summer, and I had to say to the actors, at the beginning of the play, you are two ushers. Actually, we're going to play two ushers, and you're going to get up on stage, and you're going to tell everybody to turn off their cell phones. And then the audience is going to have cards, and they're going to ask you the first questions in the play. The first scene is basically a long monologue by somebody with a few questions asked. And I said, well, let's give the audience the cards that will have the writing on it. So here you have 9 actors having to adjust to this insane idea that the audience is going to be asking them the first questions of the play. And you're having to explain virtually every moment from then on through the next 2.5 hours of this play. So the job in this case is entirely trying to explicate the ideas that you have had, where in the case of something like Rabbit Hole, you're just trying to assure that the playwright's words are acted upon by the actors, basically. It's just about the behavior that the playwright has written. So the job is monumentally different from one play to the next. And all plays have various degrees of that difference.
That's very beautifully put. I mean, essentially what you're saying also is that there's different modes of interpretation, right? I mean, you are actually, for Shakespeare, you are, in a sense, a sort of co-writer with Shakespeare in terms of the idea. You are writing a scene with him, I mean, in terms of the sort of circumstances, yeah. Right. And with Rabbit Hole, because it was a premiere also, which is also a very unique thing in the theater, that you're working with a playwright on a play that has never been seen by anyone before, as opposed to Cymbeline, which has a history of performance.
Right. That's right.
And so the director, in a way, becomes a writer of this production. I mean, in a slightly different way than in a new play.
That's right.
With Rabbit Hole, were there rewrites? Were there a lot of rewrites during the process?
Not a lot. David Lindsay Abaire, who wrote that play, writes extremely cogently and has very finished work. There are a lot of writers I work with that sort of use the rehearsal period to actually finish their play. David wouldn't go into rehearsals without it being very much finished in his head, and very few changes were made in the process. And
were you involved in Rabbit Hole, with David? Were you looking at drafts? Were you involved in the writing process of it?
Not so much with that. Donald Margulies, who I work with a lot, Donald just does an act usually, and then we sort of work from there. So that's a completely different process.
And the theater actually trusts that Donald Margulies will be able to finish the play in a rehearsal period, which is also a lot of trust, and it usually has worked out. It has worked out. What do you feel like your responsibility is in a premiere of a play, to the playwright and to the play and the audience, et cetera? What are your responsibilities?
Well, very much to the writer.
Yeah.
And whatever the writer thinks it should be is what it should be. I may argue the point, but finally the writer is the person you follow in that process.
I would agree with that. I mean, you do have a responsibility to put up what they envision plus who you are as a director, right? Because I often think, well, I'm not merely a craftsperson in this. You have chosen me to do this rather than another director. There's a reason that a playwright is coming to you, Dan Sullivan, versus some other director, because the kind of artist that you are.
Right.
I mean, it's a relationship. Obviously, you have long-standing relationships with your collaborators. You've had great relationships, long relationships with some of your collaborators, but you are a particular. You have a particular aesthetic, I imagine, or a particular way of working, or a particular, I don't know, style is a little bit heavy-handed, but there's something about you that brings a playwright to you versus someone else, right? I'm just trying to establish a kind of, personality in the room of a director in a new play process.
Right.
It's not just an enabler,
But I just find that as with actors or directors, the writers, there is not a writer type. They're all extremely different. Some want to be heard from, that want the actors to hear from them. Some don't want to talk at all, or extremely shy and don't want to be part of the process at all. I know very often writers will wonder if I actually like their play.
Right.
And I often feel like it's not my job to like the play. It's my job to do the play, and I want to make sure you're at your best as we do the play. I even had the thing with A.R. Gurney. We're doing Sylvia. Sylvia's was done 20 years ago. It's been done all over the world. And I'm after him about changes, you know.
Good for you.
Here's a man who's 86 years old, and he's looking at me like, wait a minute, I thought you wanted to do the play. You know? And I say, yeah, but times have changed, Pete. You know, let's take a look at this again. So you know, that I always feel that just sort of moment by moment, I need to be able to challenge the writer through the evening, and you know, why a writer would come to me, I don't really know. I don't. I love writers. And I love and I fall in love with writers through the work that I read. And I want to help that writer realize that work, certainly.
But you don't. You say that it's not your job to like the play. It's your job to realize it.
Not when I'm working on it.
Not when you're working on it. Okay.
Any more than I have to love an actor's performance before the performance is there.
Right.
You know, that we're constantly trying to move it forward. So I know Wendy Wasserstein, who I work with a lot, would really wonder whether I actually liked her plays. She would be very, she would say, because I just wasn't going on about how great the play was.
Right.
I was just trying to.
But you chose the play because you liked the play.
Yeah,
I mean, which, you know, when do you know, what is it about what makes you choose a play? I guess it's just the people in the play. If there are people that I'm interested in, and it feels as though this story carries me through it in an interesting way. If I can finish the play when I read it, that's very important. Everyone, huge coup.
I generally read about 15 pages of a play, and if it hasn't, in 15 pages, if it hasn't grabbed me in some way, I don't usually finish it.
I'm definitely going to take a note on that one, because I always feel very obligated to read the whole thing.
You finish the whole thing?
I do.
Yeah.
I try, unless I really feel like I can't bear it.
Yeah.
But I think I would actually read more plays if I had that.
Well, if you're an audience member and the play hasn't gotten you in 15 pages, it's not going to work.
Right.
You know, you're not going to, finally, an hour and a half in, think, this might be good.
Right. But I guess I always hold out. I guess that's the sort of optimist in me. I think I'm quite cynical, but now sitting next to you, I feel like maybe I'm quite the optimist that maybe something amazing is going to happen in 25 pages.
Well. Yeah.
He usually doesn't. You're right. I mean, now that I'm thinking back, actually, I can excuse myself from that.
Yeah.
From that. So that's well noted.
Yeah. Now there are some plays that are only good for 15 pages.
Well, there's that too, right? But they've got
and you usually finish those, and you feel very bad about it.
Right. So it seems to me that you also you have a great balance between doing new work. Mm-hmm. And classic work, and do you feel like that it's sort of like a diet that you need a little bit of both to?
No, I think I could probably just do classic work for a long time and new work for a long time. I don't think I don't switch it off because
you're feeling like deficient in one vitamin new work.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to kind of step back a little bit and just sort of talk a little bit about how the field has changed since you began directing in the 1960s. Yes.
Yes.
What are the biggest? What's one of the largest shifts that you've seen over this past? What is that now? 40 years?
40.
Someone do the math for me.
50 years, something like 50 years.
Yeah.
50 years, let's say.
Let's just say, let's just round it up.
Certainly, I think we talked about the schools, that there are directing programs, graduate programs in schools. That was never the case at all. The ability of directors to make a living in an off-Broadway world is really not there much anymore. it was in those days. There was an active off-Broadway scene. There was a commercial off-Broadway scene that is pretty much gone. So, you know, wonderful plays will open and play at a nonprofit theater for 6 weeks and go away forever. So I think it's more difficult in some ways for directors to make a living. I think certainly the huge powerhouse of the Broadway scene, you know, the huge money-making machines that are there now that were never there before. So you have, you know, feast or famine really when it comes to the directing profession, the theater directing profession, I think. The regional theater movement has, in that time, exploded. So, you know, the opportunities for directors to work around the country has increased 100-fold since I started. That wasn't there at all then. New York was the only place to be. But that certainly has changed and has allowed, I think, a lot of directors to find work and to find homes around the country to do their work.
And certainly, I actually have to leave the city to make money in the regional theaters.
Sure.
I actually get paid more out of town than I do in town.
Yeah.
So that's a real, that's very, very true. Yeah. And when you're talking about a director making a living in the off-Broadway world, you're talking specifically, right, am I right, that the off-Broadway commercial world has died?
That's right.
Yes, because...
That's no longer, you know, it sort of came into prominence in the 50s. 60s was certainly still here in the 70s. And began to die off in the 80s. Part of it had to do with the fact that, you know, if you go off-Broadway to a show now, it would cost you $80, $85 to see an off-Broadway show. That wasn't the case in those days.
And also, you know, there's in the nonprofit world, if you're a director working off-Broadway, it runs for a certain amount of time, and then what you really hope is that it's going to move to Broadway. There's no sort of moving off Broadway for a longer run.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
So there's no chance of a life. The disparity between a nonprofit off-Broadway run and a Broadway run is...
Well, something even like Sylvia is an example. Sylvia played at Manhattan Theater Club at City Center and then moved to the John Houseman Theater. And had a nice run there. So, you know, both for a playwright and for a director, that was a possibility in those days.
Sort of doing a trip down memory lane with Daniel Sullivan, you were the artistic director at Seattle Rep for many years.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about what that was, why you know, why you decided to move on from that, and also I'm very interested in your perspective on being an artistic director versus being a freelance director, and the sort of pros and cons of both lives for a director.
Right.
Since,
well, I worked in Seattle Rep for almost 20 years, 19 years, and since I had come from this place called the Actors Workshop in San Francisco, that was a very large acting company. In the 50s and 60s, and we came to Lincoln Center as a company, and Elia Kazan's company, half his company was here then, and we joined that company to make a company. All my artistic life was about an acting company, and that was what I felt a life in the theater should be. So when I began to run Seattle Rep, I tried to make a company. And this was during a period of time when regional theaters were just, they passed the phase where they had, where every city had to have its own company. And we're starting actually to try to find ways to make money to survive. And I came along wanting to form an acting company. And I found that I couldn't grow the company beyond about 12 actors. And if you were going to have an acting company that's worth its salt, you have to have at least 25 acting members, because you don't want to bore your audience with the same old guy playing all the old guy parts. And you want to be able to challenge your actors by giving them a lot to do. And it was just financially impossible, and has become more and more financially impossible around the country to hold on to an actual acting company. So after 19 years of trying to get this to happen, I thought, this is just, it hasn't become the thing that I remember, the thing that I remember I wanted in my life. And since we're going to have to just put together companies for every show here, why don't I just go and do my own shows? And I sort of became tired of the curatorial aspects of artistic directing, and thought, I'm actually happy in the rehearsal room. That's where I'm happy, and that's probably where I should go. So I left in '97, and I've just been doing plays I want to do since then.
So there's a kind of freedom that you have as a freelance director, choosing projects that are not necessarily tied to an institution and sort of its budget and its audience.
And it wasn't necessarily a happy decision, because I had grown up in the family of actors in the company, and it still remains, the idea, the supreme idea, that that's how we should make theater. But we've never been able to pull that together in this country. A lot of it just having to do with finances. We can't afford the size of the company, because we don't have the funding necessary for that. So that's why Lincoln Center does musicals all the time. They couldn't pull it off either. That's not a company of great American actors that are being challenged on a weekly basis in that theater. It is a theater that has to find a way to fund itself.
Right, right.
That's, they do glorious work, but it's still sad to me.
Right, that you can't, that there's not sort of that community of, or family, is what you said. I mean, and we were just discussing also that there are a few really now, Oregon Shakespeare Festival is really the last of the of the great companies that has 90 company members. I mean, it's not pure, but
no, it's a fluid group.
Yes,
but
but that there's and that the days of an actor being able to wield a sword and do Shakespeare and do a new play and have all of the be challenged in all of these different genres and is sort of not the now.
It's not now, and I don't know how it ever will be.
Yeah.
Given what it costs to run these institutions.
And what about sort of being in a community in Seattle and sort of knowing the community of your audiences versus, sort of presenting work to who knows what kind of people coming through the doors? I mean, is that something that's that you miss, or you like, the sort of community of audience that are attending your work?
Yes, I mean, I missed that. I certainly missed Seattle for that reason. It was an extremely literate audience who, for the most part, wanted to come to hear a play. So that was good, but that began to change over the years also. And when the .com world started to move into Seattle, there was very little interest in theater. So that audience literally started to die off.
But I did notice, when I'm working in the regional theaters, a big difference that I find really sort of amazing. Again, this community, that you get to know your community, and that the audience members are invested in a different way. That there are events that a theater might do, talking with the artists, and that the audiences come to that. The audiences are actually interested in the process in a way that New York, just for the pure, I think, you know, the market surfeited, right? I mean, it's a sort of crammed with things to see, and it's largely a tourist.
You could say it's a tourist town.
Yes, it's a tourist town.
Become a tourist town.
And that people are not necessarily as interested in the process and invested in that like they are in a regional theater, where Seattle Rep and a few other theaters at that moment were the theaters in the city.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Where, and there are pros and cons to that as well. I mean, an invested community who are, I would imagine, in Seattle Rep, you have a dedicated group of theater goers who might be able to weather the choices that you make as an artistic director, that you could put together a program, you could put together a season that might have...
That's true. But I could tell you, I could lose a lot of subscribers in a year.
Right.
You know,
was there a year that happened, and what was that, and how? And
I think it was Martha Clark's Garden of Earthly Delights. As I recall, we lost about 3,000 subscribers off of that. That was extremely offensive to many people in the audience.
And how did you, and the sort of ensuing year, did you try to get those people back?
No, I didn't try to get those people back. I was actually glad they were gone. I thought, I thought, well, okay, so let's get 3,000 other people in, because, you know, people who will at least give us a chance, you know, come to see that and not like it, but you're going to leave because we did that, you know.
Right.
And that did change, and our audience got somewhat younger.
From that particular show, or just in general?
Over the years, I think, just in terms of the kind of material that we did.
And so you did actually find
maybe
a new audience, or you started to find a new audience once you sort of eradicated the Garden of Earthly Delight haters. All right, well, let's move on into a little bit of process. This is where I get really selfish, you guys. I want to know how you can instruct me. Well, here's some silly questions. Or maybe not so silly. This is from a friend. Do you read scripts on an iPad, or do you print them out?
I print them out.
Do you ever read, and why?
I guess because I just like to hold it and refer back to it. I don't know. I just I'm an old guy. I'm used to it. You know.
Do you write stuff in it when you're reading it?
Never.
Because there is a program on the iPad
if
that you can actually write stuff on.
If I get really interested in it, sometimes I will. But usually not. Usually it's just I go as quick as I can through the script.
When you're deciding to read it, when you're deciding whether or not you want to do it, or in general?
When I'm just reading it. For the first time, I just read through as fast as I possibly can, which is hard for me because I get behaviorally bogged down sometimes, you know. So I just have to try and stay with the dialogue.
You mean behaviorally, like you want to eat popcorn, or like the behaviorally Because that's my problem.
No.
It's my behavior that I get a problem.
Involved in the behavior, like, how would you do that?
You
know, that's an interesting thing to try to do, and then it stops me. But I try to go through as fast, try to read it in real time, like it would play.
Right. And if you decide to do it, and before the first rehearsal, how many times do you think you read through the play before your first rehearsal?
Not as many as I probably should.
Same.
Yeah.
Same.
I probably should read it more. I remember there was a book by a man named Dietrich called Play Direction when I was in college.
Just Dietrich?
His name was somebody Dietrich.
Oh, okay.
And it was about what you're supposed to do. You were supposed to read the play 7 times, I remember. And I thought, well, I'd probably do that, but I don't, you know, I wouldn't sit down and read it 7 times. That would be boring. I'd hate it by the 7th time.
Yeah. So you have ADD like myself. I mean, I feel like, you know, who wants to read it? We're going to stage it.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
That's actually totally satisfies this question that I'm going to ask you, and maybe you have another. Do you have a pre-production secret you'd like to share with me? That satisfied me. So just so you know, but do you do something in pre-production that that you've, I don't know. Is there something you do in pre-production that you always do? Let's just say that.
Well, I do a lot of music stuff. I collect like music that even if it doesn't involve music, I find I put together sort of what would be mixtapes of the old days.
Really?
Of music, yeah.
So what did you like? What kind of music did you put together for Sylvia?
Nothing.
Right.
I didn't obey that rule with Sylvia, but generally I do. I also but that's also, I find, a sort of active avoidance.
Yes. That's the secret I want to know. How do you avoid?
It's an active avoidance. So you're sort of tangentially dealing with the material, but not really.
Right.
Not really making decisions about it. Because finally, it's really about the actors. So a lot of questions that you have are really not going to be answered until the actors are there.
Right.
You know.
So what design?
But I can't tell you the story of the play. If you were to ask me what's your play about and what's the story, I'd be able to sort of take you through page by page, pretty much through the play and tell you the story, and you know. But
could you say it in 3 sentences or less to me?
No.
Me neither. I feel like this is all. There's so much sort of pressure on. You need to.
No, that whole reductive thing. That's the reductive Hollywood
marketing thing.
It's the Hollywood thing. It's like, you know, tell me that if you can't tell me the story in 3 sentences, it's not going to work.
Okay.
That kind of thing.
All right. Yeah. Released. That's another release that I can check off for myself. So it sounds like maybe you start with sound in terms of your way into a play, but is that true in terms of design element? Where do you start in design? Which discipline?
Well, I mean, first is you try to match. It's sort of like casting. You try to match the designer with the play.
Yeah.
So I generally have some idea, but it usually is about the designer. That this feels like this is sort of characterologically like this designer, and then carry on from there in terms of how you actually do it.
Oh, that's interesting. So, meaning that you could, let's say that you feel like a lighting, like Brian McDevitt, feels totally right, and then you will start with Brian in terms of the discussion of the play?
No.
Okay.
Usually with the lighting designer would be the last thing that would come along. It would be the scene designer who is the principal collaborator, and I would very much allow that scene designer to help in terms of the choice of the lighting designer.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I want to make sure that that's a really good collaboration, and I've made the mistake before of hiring a scene designer and hiring a lighting designer and then finding out that that's not going to work, that they either hate each other or they just don't feel that color-wise this thing is going to work out.
Right.
So the scene designer is the principal collaborator.
That's your way in. I mean,
it's
feel
the
like
way in. Just the actual space, you know, the space you're going to do this thing in, I think is.
I feel the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like if I don't understand the world of the play and the space, I can't actually do anything else.
Yeah.
And that's primarily for me my pre-production work is design.
Right.
Because designers are the best dramaturgs, I think, as we're going through.
Right.
So that's interesting. And do you feel like there's a design element that you understand? That you really understand, and then like what is the design element that you feel like you really understand, and the design element that you feel like is more elusive to you?
Costumes.
Understand or elusive?
It's not so much elusive as I just don't sort of. I mean, I can respond to it, but I can't contribute that much.
Yeah.
So you know, I work with the same people a lot for that
Who do you
reason.
work with? Who do you work? Who's your?
I work a lot with Jane Greenwood. Jane has sort of been my go-to person for a long time.
And do you find that you work with the same designers over and over again?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. But also, you know, match them, like Ricardo Hernandez designed Cymbeline. He did it before. I've worked with him a couple of times on things, and I choose him for very specific reasons. You know, when he seems to match the world of the play.
I tried to get him for Sydney, and he wasn't available.
Yeah.
I love Ricardo Hernandez.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry.
That's all right. He's probably doing your show. Do you have a way when you first sit down with a set designer? Well, here's a question. Do you try to, your first design meeting, do you try to get everyone together, or do you have a separate, or do you meet with a designer one-on-one?
I find that's really hard to do.
It's
just
the ideal,
hard to
right?
do.
It's the ideal
It's
thing
the
to do,
ideal
but
to
it's
do.
absolutely
Yeah.
never works out, right?
I did Shakespeare once where I got all of the designers together, and I had actually one of my mixtapes of all the music and things that I had, you know, that I thought were sort of fundamental to my the world that I wanted to. And I remember, like, halfway through the mixtape, they were like, you know, come on, Dan. You know, it was about time. You know, they all had planes to catch.
No, it's true.
You know.
And it is true, it's so rare that you get everyone together that you feel like when you do, you're like, oh shit, what am I supposed to,
Yes, right.
who am I supposed to address and what am I supposed
Right.
to?
But it's also about, like, they, you know, their world is, okay, show me, you know, like, scene designer goes first, show me the thing, I'll see the colors, then we'll talk to the lighting designers. Like, don't actually pretend that the three of us are going to come
Right.
up with something. Yeah.
It's real, yeah, in terms of time, but yeah. It's true. So when you first meet with your set designer, do you have something that how does the conversation start? Do you start with images? You just start with how do you start the conversation?
I sometimes don't ever even talk about the play for a while. We talk about stuff that the play might bring up, but we don't really talk about the play so much. If it's a play we both respond to, you know, for me, it's a sort of social thing.
That's interesting, yeah.
So it's the work itself finally happens, but it happens very tangentially, not like, how are we going to do this? But you finally start talking about the play, you talk about the deficiencies of the play, you talk about the strengths of the play, you talk about usually one moment, just one moment in the play, and how are you going to do that? And usually that's the sort of bubble that grows and becomes a design.
Do you mean, and is that moment that happens, is it usually like a sort of technical challenge?
Yeah, sometimes it's a technical challenge. Sometimes it's something that it's a question, like what does that actually mean? How do we actually make is that a sensible idea that should happen in this play, and that finding a way either to make it sensible or to throw it out, you know. But I like talking about the problems that the play presents as opposed to the world of the play to begin with.
And so does it take a couple of meetings before you actually get to the world, or how does the world of the play start to evolve?
Usually, it depends. I've worked with John Lee Beattie, who I work with a lot. John Lee sometimes will meet 5-6 times before we'll ever actually move forward. You keep talking about the play until, because the set is character also,
yeah.
and he can't get the character. So you just keep at it until finally there's something that he can take, as we all do from memory. It's all about behavior, and we bring to the stage the behavior we remember. The same with the designer. He brings a space that he can remember, that he knows he's inhabited in some way. That's the only way he can make it real for himself. That's that way he designs. And for me, that's great because it's characterological. You know.
And did you usually, once there's a model, do you storyboard through? I mean, how do you sort of get to the, you don't storyboard through?
No.
Yeah.
No, just the model. The model's it, really, basically.
Right. And then you sort of figure out
and
how.
a lot, I mean, I work with a lot of designers who don't do models. They just do drawings.
Really?
Yeah.
So you must be really good spatially, because I am really
You'd have to have
spatially
the
challenged.
thing.
I absolutely, people will show me, I don't know, what are they called? What are they called where they're like the technical designs or the
ground plan?
Ground plans
Oh,
and
ground plan,
the sections. And I'm like, I have no idea what this is. I have no, and I actually really do need a physical, I definitely need I definitely need a model to sort of, because I'm so literal. I mean, you know, I work on all these not literal plays, but I myself am very literal.
Right.
And so in order to sort of figure out how it works, I mean, I would love to, give me a really good drawing, you know what I mean?
But this is
really
the case.
detailed, so you have like
Some
a really
designers do really bad models, or they do the little quarter-inch model that you can barely, you know. So
That's
give me
true.
a nice drawing.
That is that's good to know.
Right.
I always feel like there has to be. Okay, so what do you do on your first day of rehearsal?
Just read through the play. I don't like first days, so basically it's a very short day. You read through it, then you go home and you think, what have I done? You're right. And then you come back to it having thought that out. But I don't like to talk about the play a lot. If it's an unusual concept, I have to start to bring the actors into the idea to begin with. But generally, I don't like to talk about it too much, and I try to give the first few days over to the writer, if it's a new play.
How has Shakespeare done talking to your company?
He's pretty good.
He's pretty good.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
He doesn't like a lot of changes.
But he has to accept them. So I always feel like the first day, this sort of ownness, especially because of the relationship between the institution and the play, right? So the institution comes in and says, welcome to everyone, and now we'll hear from Anne Kauffman about why she wants to, you know what I mean? So I always sort of a little bit crap my pants on the first day of rehearsal because you feel like this ownness.
And you've got a gun to your head. And,
I totally get into my head, and all I wish is that everyone would go away and we could just start reading through it and get down to business. And it does depend on the play, because sometimes I do feel like there's an orientation to the play. I think it's like what you're talking about, sort of bringing the actors into the concept of the play. But do you find that there's this sort of, will that end as I get, more mature?
It will. and you have to do what I've done. I've cultivated a reputation of reticence. So Dan doesn't say anything. So I can actually not say anything and nobody minds.
I think that's really smart. I think as
so if you, but you have to cultivate that reputation.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I talk a lot, so it's a I'm a little late in the thing, but I feel like I think it's interesting. In Chicago, what they do is they actually leave you alone at both at Steppenwolf and the Goodman.
Yeah.
They don't do, they basically come in, they say hello, and then they leave us alone for the first read through, which is actually quite humane, I think. Yeah. So and I also have heard people say that the first day is really just to get to the second day of rehearsal. Just get past through that. Yeah.
Exactly.
But has that changed over the when you were first starting out? Did you make great grand speeches and inspirational speeches and Henry V speeches to?
I don't think I've ever done that, but I'm just not capable of it.
Right.
So it's not something, but as a younger director, I did feel I had to be in control of everything.
Yes.
That was the thing.
And what did that look like?
Well, I don't know that it looked any different finally in terms of result, but it was not particularly pleasant for anybody, particularly
Including
me.
you, right.
So when I was able to sort of relax and really count on the casting that I'd done and see it as a collaborative experience and not one in which, not a dictatorial one, things became a lot easier. And particularly if you've decided, I'm going to do this for the rest of my life, how awful if you have to constantly rigidly hold on to control all the time. You know?
Did you feel like actors ever sort of led you to the idea that you didn't have to be in control, or did you just come to that yourself?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how. I think it just evolved over a period of time. That just the idea of trust, you know, that you have to trust your initial decision that this was going to be your family for the next couple of months.
Right.
And know that what you were responding to were the instincts of the actors originally when you cast them. So you have to be led by that.
Right. I feel like we're coming to an end, unfortunately. I have so many more questions to ask you, but can I ask one last question? What is your biggest fear during the process? Is there a particular point in the process that you dread, that sort of is a sort of landmark that happens in every production?
Opening night?
You dread opening night?
Well, yeah. I mean, the idea that this thing is finished, which
Right.
is never really is, but
Right.
the idea that somehow you're going to stop the work, and because there are always, you know, if you usually you sit there on opening night and think like, oh boy, that's not good. That could have been different. So everything up to then, to me, is always very healthy.
I really need to be mentored by you. I think you are an inspiration, Mr. Sullivan. That's why I don't sit at opening nights, because I don't want to sit there and watch how everything is. Yes. Well, thank you so much.
Well,
this has been incredible. And on behalf of Lonnie Price and Matt Coward, we would like to thank Godfrey Polaya, Jordana Pocumpi. Oh my gosh, Jordana, wherever you are, I adore you and I'm sorry. Tom Dunn, Jillian Campbell, and the staff of the David Rubenstein Atrium. We hope to see you all back here tomorrow night at 7:30 for a very special event, Lincoln Center Originals Songwriters, where 7 musical theater composer and lyricist teams have created original songs inspired by the Lincoln Center campus. So thank you all for coming tonight and hope to see you tomorrow night. Oh my God, you were awesome.